The documentary doesn't shock you with a new leak about Diddy, 50 Cent, or Justin Bieber. It does something far more unsettling. It takes moments involving all three moments that were always public and forces you to watch them without the laughter, without the edits, without the excuses. And when you do that, those same clips stop feeling harmless. They start feeling like a timeline nobody ever wanted to slow down. Because once the celebrity glaze fades, a different question takes over. Not what happened, but how it was allowed to feel normal. How adults watched certain moments unfold in real time and decided there was nothing to question. And why, years later, those same moments suddenly feel heavier than anyone remembers. Here's why this documentary hits differently now. It doesn't claim to uncover hidden footage. It reorganizes what we already saw, and that reorganization changes everything. When familiar clips are placed in a new order, patterns emerge that were impossible to see when everything felt random. And once people start noticing patterns, they don't stop. At its core, this isn't a story about one accusation or one rumor. It's about access. The kind of access that placed Justin Bieber inside adult power structures before he had the tools to navigate them. The kind of access that surrounded Diddy with enormous influence and little resistance. And the kind of access that allowed voices like 50 Cent to be dismissed for years as noise instead of treated as pressure. The documentary opens by grounding the viewer in context. It revisits early public appearances, interviews, and behind-the-scenes moments that once circulated as entertainment. Not to sensationalize them, but to slow them down. Jokes that once flew by are replayed without reaction shots. Casual promises are allowed to sit without laughter covering them. The film doesn't accuse anyone in these moments. It simply removes the momentum that once carried them past scrutiny. And that's when the discomfort starts to set in. For decades, the entertainment industry survived by reframing discomfort. If a moment felt strange but profitable, it wasn't questioned, it was repackaged. Interviews that should have raised eyebrows were turned into viral clips. Situations that deserved boundaries were reframed as industry culture. Over time, proximity to power became confused with protection, and success became a shield against accountability. When people talk about Justin Bieber's rise, they usually talk in numbers. Chart positions, sales, global fame before adulthood. What rarely gets discussed is the environment surrounding that rise, an adult ecosystem built on hierarchy, influence, and unspoken rules. In that world, success wasn't just about talent. It was about proximity. Who opened doors? Who vouched for you? Who decided which behavior was harmless and which concerns were overreactions? This is where Diddy's name consistently reappears, not as a verdict, not as a proven charge in this discussion, but as a symbol of concentrated influence in that environment. Power, reach, authority, and the ability to normalize behavior simply by being present. When someone with that level of influence appears repeatedly in early career footage involving very young artists, the footage doesn't need to show a crime to raise serious questions. It only needs to show what's missing: clear boundaries. The documentary makes a deliberate choice here. It doesn't build toward a shocking reveal. It builds toward recognition. It places interviews from different years side by side. It contrasts how the same situations were described at the time versus how they feel now. It highlights who was laughing, who was silent, and who moved conversations forward instead of stopping them. The film never tells the viewer what conclusion to reach, but it removes the distractions that once made those moments easy to dismiss. That silence becomes the through line. Because when adults don't interrupt, don't question, and don't pause the moment, a message is sent without being spoken. This is acceptable. This is normal. This is how it works here. And once that message is absorbed, it becomes part of the system. This is also where many viewers instinctively push back. That's not evidence. And legally, they're right. But the documentary isn't trying to win a courtroom argument. It's examining culture. And culture is judged by patterns we choose to ignore. Patterns of who gets access. Patterns of who gets protected. Patterns of how discomfort is reframed when the right names are involved. This is where 50 Cent enters the story in a different way. For years, his comments were easy to dismiss. Rivalry, provocation, clout-seeking. That framing worked because it was convenient. It allowed uncomfortable implications to be brushed aside without examination. But timing changes how messages land. When commentary is placed next to reorganized footage and viewed through today's heightened public scrutiny climate, it stops sounding like noise and starts sounding like pressure applied over time. The documentary doesn't present 50 Cent as a moral authority. It presents him as a disruptor of forgetfulness. Someone who kept referencing what others preferred to move past. Not proof, not verdicts, pressure. And pressure is what keeps stories from disappearing. Before we go any further, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because what comes next moves beyond individual moments and starts revealing why these environments didn't just exist once they repeated. And let me ask you this in the comments. Do you think silence in the industry was driven more by fear or by self-protection? What the documentary does next is crucial. It shifts away from personalities and toward structure. Not escalation, yet pattern recognition. Different artists, different years, same dynamics. Young talent enters adult spaces. Access is granted through powerful intermediaries. Boundaries are treated as flexible. Outcomes vary, but the structure stays the same. This is why the film doesn't rely on one shocking clip. It relies on accumulation, because when moments that once felt isolated begin echoing across time, coincidence becomes harder to argue, not because every situation is identical, but because the system never corrected itself. And that realization is where the story truly begins. Because once you see the structure, you can't unsee it. And the next part of this documentary is where observation turns into something much heavier. What the documentary does next is slow the story down even further, but this time, it isn't slowing moments. It's slowing movement. It begins tracing how environments like this don't form accidentally. They're built, reinforced, passed down. And once you start seeing how access actually works, the randomness disappears. The film breaks the illusion that proximity is casual. It shows how access inside the entertainment industry isn't just about talent or opportunity, it's about gatekeeping. Who controls introductions? Who decides which rooms matter? Who frames behavior as normal before anyone has the chance to question it? In that world, influence doesn't need to explain itself. It just needs to exist. This is where the documentary becomes more specific without becoming reckless. It revisits public-facing interviews, award show appearances, backstage moments, and early career footage clips that once circulated independently and places them into a sequence. Not to sensationalize them, but to show repetition. Similar language, similar jokes, similar assumptions, different settings, same dynamic. The pattern is subtle, but it's consistent. Young artists are introduced into adult spaces under the banner of mentorship. Access is framed as privilege. Discomfort is reframed as opportunity. And because everything is wrapped in success, the absence of boundaries is rarely questioned. Not because people don't notice, but because noticing complicates things. This is where Justin Bieber's position becomes clearer in the structure of the story. The documentary doesn't present him as someone making claims or pointing fingers. It presents him as someone navigating a system that was already in motion before he arrived. Early visibility, early access, early expectations. The film contrasts moments of confidence with moments of overwhelm, not as a diagnosis, but as trajectory. When those moments are viewed in isolation, they look like personal struggles. When they're placed next to the environment that produced them, they start to feel less random. Pressure accumulates quietly. Control erodes gradually. None of this requires malicious intent to create damage. It only requires imbalance. The documentary reinforces this by showing how responsibility becomes diffuse in hierarchies. When authority is spread across managers, labels, mentors, and executives, accountability evaporates. Everyone assumes someone else is watching. Everyone assumes someone else will step in if something crosses a line. And because of that assumption, intervention becomes optional. That's how systems protect themselves without saying a word. This is also where the film begins examining silence not as absence, but as incentive. In an industry built on relationships, silence preserves access. Speaking introduces risk. Careers depend on staying in favor. Reputation depends on not being difficult. Over time, this calculation becomes automatic. People don't consciously decide to stay quiet. They learn that quiet is rewarded. The documentary illustrates this without accusing anyone directly. It simply shows who speaks, who doesn't, and when the conversation moves on. Moments that could have been paused are accelerated. Jokes land. Laughter fills the space where caution should have lived. And the system continues uninterrupted. This is where Diddy's role is framed with more clarity, not as a headline figure, but as a gatekeeper whose presence shaped rooms. Rooms where careers accelerated. Rooms where norms were set. Rooms where behavior didn't need to be explained because influence itself did the explaining. The documentary doesn't suggest intent here. It highlights impact. Influence leaves fingerprints, even when no one touches anything directly. The film reinforces this point by revisiting how public perception worked at the time. How celebrity insulated behavior from scrutiny. How success was treated as proof that nothing was wrong. And how questioning powerful figures was framed as jealousy, rivalry, or disrespect. These weren't written rules, but they were enforced all the same. This is where 50 Cent's commentary gains new context. The documentary positions him not as a witness or a source of evidence, but as a consistent external voice. Someone who never fully depended on the same access structures he criticized. That distance matters. It explains why his commentary persisted while others stayed silent. Not because he was necessarily right about everything, but because he had less to lose by speaking. The film doesn't elevate him as a hero. It frames him as friction. And friction slows systems down. By placing his past statements alongside reorganized footage and present-day scrutiny, the documentary shows how timing transforms meaning. What once sounded like provocation now sounds like pressure that refused to disappear. Not proof, not conclusions, pressure. And pressure accumulates. As these elements stack, the narrative grows heavier, not louder. Heavier, because what's emerging isn't a scandal. It's a structure that allowed the same dynamics to repeat across different artists, different eras, and different levels of fame. This is the point where the documentary deliberately resists escalation. It doesn't jump to consequences yet. It lets the viewer sit with recognition, with the realization that this wasn't chaos, it was architecture. And architecture doesn't collapse on its own. It waits. What changes the tone of the documentary at this stage isn't a new clip or a shocking statement. It's behavior. The film begins showing what happens when attention stops being casual and starts becoming sustained. Not outrage, not viral noise, sustained focus. Up until now, everything could still be dismissed as hindsight or cultural reevaluation. Old clips, new feelings. But here, the documentary introduces something different. Reaction. Quiet reaction. The kind that only appears when systems sense risk. Language starts tightening. Appearances become selective. Associations that once felt casual suddenly feel calculated. No announcements are made. No explanations are offered. But the shift is visible if you're paying attention. And the documentary is built for viewers who are paying attention now. This is where influence begins to feel measurable. The film places earlier public statements next to more recent ones, not to accuse, but to contrast. What was once said freely is now said carefully. What once felt confident now feels restrained. The gaps aren't dramatic, but they're consistent. And consistency is what gives the contrast weight. This is where Diddy's presence carries a different gravity. Not the sensational weight of headlines, but the institutional weight of scrutiny. Influence that once blended into the background now stands out because influence doesn't disappear when attention arrives, it becomes traceable. Timelines matter. Context matters. What was brushed aside before now feels documented. The documentary is deliberate here. It never suggests it replaces investigations. It never claims to know outcomes. Instead, it shows how systems behave when they realize they're being observed for longer than expected. And systems don't wait for verdicts to protect themselves. They respond to risk. That response doesn't look like confession. It looks like distance. People speak less. Words are chosen with care. Familiar faces stop appearing together without explanation. The documentary doesn't frame this as guilt. It frames it as awareness, because awareness changes incentives long before accountability arrives. This is the part most viewers underestimate. When power feels safe, it's loud. When power feels exposed, it becomes quiet. The film tracks this shift across multiple moments. Not dramatic moments, subtle ones. Pauses where there used to be jokes. Non-answers where there used to be confidence. Silence where there used to be access. None of it proves wrongdoing, but all of it proves adjustment. And adjustment is not neutral. This is also where 50 Cent's role sharpens without changing. He doesn't suddenly reveal new information. He doesn't escalate his claims. He stays consistent, and that consistency becomes the point. While others recalibrate, he doesn't. While language tightens, his references remain unchanged. The documentary frames this not as righteousness, but as position. He was never fully dependent on the same access structures, so he never needed to adapt to protect them. That difference matters. Because systems don't struggle with attacks, they struggle with persistence. Noise fades. Pressure accumulates. As this pressure builds, the documentary widens the lens again. It moves from individual reactions to institutional behavior. It shows how organizations respond when reputation becomes fragile. Policies are revisited quietly. Legal language appears where casual language once lived. Conversations move behind closed doors. None of this signals resolution. It signals preparation. Preparation for what comes next. This is where the story surrounding Justin Bieber takes on its heaviest meaning. Not because of any new revelation, but because of timing. His earlier experiences are now being revisited through a lens that didn't exist when they happened. A lens shaped by conversations about power imbalance, consent, and responsibility. The same events haven't changed, but their implications have. The documentary places moments of early access next to moments of later withdrawal. Early visibility next to later retreat. Confidence next to exhaustion. The contrast isn't framed as blame. It's framed as consequence. And consequence doesn't require intent to exist. This is where the film makes one of its most effective moves. It stops asking who did what and starts asking what environments produce. Because when similar outcomes appear across different people, different eras, and different circumstances, coincidence stops being convincing. The pattern isn't criminality. The pattern is tolerance. Tolerance of imbalance. Tolerance of silence. Tolerance of the idea that success cancels out risk. And once that tolerance is questioned publicly, the system reacts not by admitting fault, but by adjusting behavior. That's the reality the documentary lets sit without commentary. This is where many viewers expect a dramatic escalation. A name, a moment, a reveal. But the film refuses to give that satisfaction. Instead, it shows something more unsettling. How large systems survive scrutiny without ever answering for it. They adapt. They become quieter. They become careful. They wait. Waiting works because attention rarely sustains itself. Outrage burns fast. Fatigue sets in. New stories replace old ones. And for a long time, that cycle protected everyone involved. What's different now is that the cycle didn't reset. The documentary makes this clear by showing how each attempt to dismiss the conversation only added to its weight. Old footage didn't disappear. Commentary didn't stop. Public awareness didn't fade, it layered. And once enough layers exist, dismissal stops functioning the way it used to. This is the point where the story stops feeling like commentary and starts feeling like consequence. Not legal consequence, structural consequence. The kind that alters how people move, speak, and associate. And that's when the most uncomfortable realization settles in. Awareness alone doesn't produce accountability. Produces adaptation. Systems don't collapse when they're exposed. They learn how to survive exposure. They figure out which conversations to avoid, which associations to loosen, which risks to manage quietly. And to an outside observer, that can look like progress if you're not watching closely. The documentary forces you to watch closely. It doesn't tell you the system is changing for the better. It asks whether change that preserves power without addressing harm should count as progress at all. And it leaves that question unresolved because resolution would imply an ending. There isn't one yet. What exists instead is a tension that didn't exist before. A tension between visibility and silence, between awareness and action, between adaptation and accountability. And once that tension enters a system, nothing inside it operates the same way again. This is where the film stops revisiting the past and starts hovering over the present. Because what matters now isn't what happened years ago, it's what happens after people realize they can't unsee it. And that's the moment the story crosses a line. Not into certainty, but into consequence. What the documentary ultimately leaves you with isn't an answer, it's a mirror. By this point, it's clear the story was never about delivering a neat conclusion. It was about exposing how long unresolved systems can function when they're protected by success, silence, and selective memory. Because once you step back far enough, this isn't a story about one person or one era. It's about what happens when power concentrates and oversight dissolves, when access becomes currency, when influence replaces accountability, and when discomfort is treated as a branding problem instead of a warning sign. At this stage, the conversation around Diddy doesn't hinge on allegations or defenses. It hinges on legacy under re-examination. A legacy built in a time when celebrity insulated behavior, when scrutiny was optional, and when questioning authority carried real consequences. That insulation doesn't operate the same way anymore. And when it cracks, everything inside it becomes visible, sometimes all at once. But visibility doesn't automatically bring justice. Power doesn't usually collapse when it's exposed. It recalibrates. It becomes quieter, more strategic, more careful about where it appears and what it says. And then it waits. Because waiting has always been one of power's most reliable tools. This is the mechanism the documentary leaves you staring at. Systems like this don't survive on secrecy alone. They survive on fatigue, on the assumption that attention won't last, that outrage will burn hot and fast, then fade. For years, that assumption proved correct. Every time the conversation resurfaced, it did so in fragments never sustained enough to force real change. What's different now isn't outrage. It's accumulation. Old footage didn't disappear. Commentary didn't stop. Cultural awareness didn't reset. Each layer added weight instead of noise. And once enough weight exists, dismissal stops working the way it used to. Not because everyone agrees, but because forgetting becomes harder. That's why the focus keeps drifting away from individuals and back toward systems. Because even when one person faces consequences, the conditions that allowed the behavior don't automatically disappear. The same pipelines remain. The same incentives exist. The same imbalance between youth and authority persists. Without structural change, risk doesn't vanish, it relocates. This is where Justin Bieber's presence in the story carries its deepest meaning. Not as an accuser, not as a defendant, but as evidence of cost. The cost of entering an adult power structure before protection is fully formed. The cost of success arriving faster than safeguards. The cost of silence being rewarded as professionalism. That cost doesn't show up in court records. It shows up later, in withdrawal, in exhaustion, in attempts to reclaim control over a life that never fully belonged to the person living it. When people dismiss this as celebrity problems, they miss the point entirely. Fame doesn't erase vulnerability. It often hides it. This isn't about fame. It's about what happens when fame intersects with unchecked authority. This is also where 50 Cent's role settles into focus one final time. Not as proof, not as resolution, but as disruption. His refusal to let the conversation fade doesn't make him the judge of truth, but it makes silence harder to sustain. And silence is what protected this ecosystem for so long. What the documentary makes clear by the end is that the industry isn't preparing for closure. It's preparing for adaptation. Policies tighten quietly. Associations shift. Language becomes careful. Distances appear without explanation. This isn't accountability in the emotional sense, but it is reaction. And reaction tells you something has changed. Because systems don't react unless they feel exposed. The public, meanwhile, is left without a single moment of resolution. There's no verdict that answers every question. No headline that closes the conversation. Instead, there's a growing recognition that some of the most damaging dynamics don't announce themselves as crimes. They announce themselves as norms, as jokes, as that's just how it works. And once you recognize that, you can't unsee it. That's why this story refuses to end. Not because people crave controversy, but because unresolved systems don't close themselves. They linger, they echo, they resurface every time a new generation enters the same structure, and the same mistakes repeat under new names. So the question this documentary leaves behind isn't whether one film exposed everything. It's whether exposure is enough at all. Whether awareness without reform actually changes outcomes, or whether it simply documents the cycle before it repeats again, quieter and more carefully than before. Because when power, access, and silence align, damage doesn't need intent. It only needs permission. If you've made it this far, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because this story isn't over and we'll be covering every development the moment it breaks. And let me know in the comments. Do you believe the industry is capable of real change? Or will it simply adapt and move on? This is the hidden evidence.